He buttoned his shirt without looking up, but left the second one undone, like the night still needed room to breathe. The hallway smelled faintly of cedarwood and something sweeter, like memory melting into the floorboards. I didn't flinch when the door closed behind him. I just watched the shadows shift across the kitchen tiles, softer now but permanent. I wasn't mistaken. I was wide awake when I crossed the line. I used to think I had trained myself out of want. That stillness was my strength. That a quiet dinner alone and the soft crackle of an old ceramic mug in my palm meant I had made peace with being enough. I had unlearned the language of needing, at least that's what I told myself. Until the day Claire called, her voice all breath and speed, saying she'd be coming home for a few weeks. And Julian's coming with me, she added like it was nothing. A name with no weight. Just sound. But something in me shifted, barely, but enough to make me put the kettle down before the water boiled. Julian arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The light was soft that day, slanting through the porch screen like a memory I didn't know I missed. He carried a cello case, old and scuffed, and a canvas bag slung too low like it had been his too long. He smiled, nodded politely, and said, "Thank you for having me," in a tone so still it almost felt rehearsed. We had soup that night. Claire talked, laughed, gestured wide like she always did. Julian didn't interrupt. He watched, listened. Every now and then his eyes drifted toward the window, not out of boredom, but like he was listening to something only he could hear. I noticed. I shouldn't have. But I did. Later that night, as I passed the living room to head upstairs, I heard it. A single low note from the cello, hesitant. Then another, drawn out, unsure. He wasn't playing for anyone. It was more like he was tuning memory. The sound wasn't music yet, but it stayed in the air long after he stopped, hanging there like mist that refused to settle. In the morning I saw him standing in the garden barefoot, holding a mug in both hands, staring into nothing. The same mug I usually used. Something about that image, it shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. It was too early for words. So I just nodded at him through the window. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did. It was hard to tell with men like Julian. He wasn't flirtatious. He wasn't warm. But there was a stillness to him that made the rooms feel more awake. Not brighter, just more alert. When I passed behind him in the hallway later that day, my shoulder almost brushed his back. He didn't move. Neither did I. It wasn't contact. Not really. But something passed between us. Unsaid, unnamed, impossible to replay without doubting it. That evening when I reached for the switch to turn off the hallway light, I paused. It wasn't habit. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was just that I could still feel the outline of someone who had stood too close without touching. I told myself it was just a feeling. But feelings, like music, always know when to come back. Claire left early most mornings, camera in hand, eyes still half closed, chasing whatever light made her feel like herself again. She'd return only when the sky bruised purple or not at all, texting me quick updates like, "Don't wait up," or, "We found a foggy trail near the coast." It gave the house a new rhythm. Two people moving without speaking much, sharing the same rooms but never colliding. Julian moved like a shadow that learned how to breathe. Always polite, always quiet, always just far enough not to be noticed, unless you were already noticing. He offered to help with dishes, always dried his cup with the same towel, and never left fingerprints on the faucet. But the air changed when he was around. Not colder, not warmer, just aware. I caught myself folding the same napkin twice. Not because it needed straightening, but because I could feel him behind me in the room, close yet unspoken. Sometimes I'd open a window just to reset the air between us. But even then, the house didn't breathe the way it used to. One morning I asked, "Did you sleep at all last night?" My voice wasn't sharp, just curious. Maybe too soft. He glanced up from his tea, then toward the ceiling as if listening for something neither of us could name. "There are some notes," he said, "that only arrive when the house gets quiet enough." He smiled, but not at me. At the thought, perhaps. Still, I felt like it landed between us. I heard him practice most evenings. Not full pieces, just fragments. Single notes repeated until they lost their shape and became something heavier. I never entered the room, but I often paused by the edge of the doorframe, eyes resting on the cello, leaning into his chest like it belonged there. He didn't know I watched. Or maybe he did, and that was part of it. In the kitchen, I started noticing the way sunlight fell through the blinds around 4:10 p.m. Always the same line of gold cutting across the tiled floor, always landing between our feet. It became a kind of marker. A thread. He'd stand by the counter, not saying much, hands resting on the rim of the sink like he was holding a thought he hadn't decided to speak aloud. I'd be at the stove, stirring something already done, pretending not to wait for something unscheduled. Once, I caught his reflection in the glass cabinet door. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at where I had just stood. Like even absence could echo. The tension didn't come from what we said. Came from everything we didn't. From the way the air between us began to hum like a string too tightly tuned. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a mistake. It was a rhythm, subtle, repeating, unclaimed. It was a Thursday near the end of the month. The air felt stretched thin like paper held too close to flame. Claire had texted around 5. Staying out for dinner. Fog's beautiful on the cliffs. I'd already sensed it somehow. Not in the words, but in how easily I set the second wine glass aside without hesitation. The house for once didn't echo. It breathed. Light from the kitchen window poured in long and low, draping itself across the tile like a forgotten scarf. Even the dust floating in that light seemed to wait, for something or someone, or the moment that made silence heavier than sound. Julian was in the living room. I could hear the cello. Not in melody, just tone. Notes sliding into each other, not quite music, not quite memory. It reminded me of how grief returns, not with pain but with precision. I carried a glass of red wine barefoot, slower than usual. The floor creaked once, but not enough to interrupt the thread. He looked up when I placed the glass on the low table between us. No greeting. No explanation. Just eyes that didn't blink, and breath that didn't rise too fast. We sat, him on the far edge of the couch, me not far, but not near either. I felt the cushion dip beneath me, a subtle shift I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the weight of a man beside me. It was the weight of being noticed. He didn't reach for me. He didn't lean in. Just sat, still holding the bow like it was mid-sentence. And I, without thinking, placed my hand on the edge of the glass he hadn't touched. Not as an offer. Just to feel the warmth still lingering from the notes. When he moved, it was barely movement. His hand rose, slow, deliberate. Not toward my face. Toward the space just above my ribs. Right where the heart aches when it remembers something it never got to finish. He didn't press. He didn't ask. He just stopped there. I didn't flinch. I breathed deeper. That one breath folded the room in half. Suddenly the sofa felt too narrow. The air too still. And when his hand closed, not to hold, but to answer something I hadn't asked aloud, I felt known. Not admired. Not wanted. Known. I had forgotten what it felt like to be read without interruption. To be open like a score someone had practiced quietly in another room, waiting for the right hour to play aloud. He leaned forward, not to meet me but to meet something between us. Not lust. Not comfort. Recognition. My name never left his mouth. But somehow I heard it. The cello rested quietly beside him now. Its absence louder than its sound. I didn't think about Claire. I didn't think about consequences. I only thought, it has been too long since anyone believed my body still had a language of its own. The glass stayed untouched between us. But my hand never left it. Neither did his gaze. And when the light outside the window shifted, I knew nothing would return to what it was, even if no one said a word. Claire came back on a Monday morning. Her boots thudded against the hallway tiles, familiar, anchoring. Julian opened the door for her like nothing had changed. Hand on her lower back, eyes kind but distant. I watched from the kitchen, stirring honey into tea I wasn't going to drink. 3 cups sat on the counter, each one in a different stage of cooling. Mine was untouched. We didn't speak of anything but errands and weather. The silence was civilized. Studied. He no longer lingered. Not in rooms. Not in doorways. Not in me. But sometimes in the reflection of the hallway mirror, our eyes would find each other. Like 2 notes in a song no one meant to write. He had moved the lamp back, but not quite to its original position. The cushion still held an indentation, shallow yes, but shaped exactly like his paws beside me. The wineglass remained where I left it, near the sink, with a faint ring of red staining the base. No one asked about it. That, too, was its own kind of permission. In the studio, I shaped clay without designs. My fingers knew the motion but not the intent. The wheel spun. The earth pressed back. And somewhere in the texture, wet, responsive, I remembered how his hand hovered over me, not to possess but to ask. There was no reply. Only breath. Still, I think he heard it. Claire would disappear mid-afternoon. Her camera slung carelessly over her shoulder. She said the light was best then. I believed her. Still, it was hard not to notice how she never invited him along. He stayed in mostly. Practiced in the living room. The same unfinished song. Its notes floating like dust motes in late light. Sometimes I'd pause outside the doorway. Not long enough to intrude. Just long enough to feel the music press against me like a memory I hadn't agreed to revisit. He didn't look up. Not once. But I could feel him know I was there. And that was enough to undo an entire morning of pretending. I didn't cry. I didn't regret. I only wondered if any of this had changed him the way it had changed me. There are things a woman only learns in silence. That clarity can be a more dangerous thrill than chaos. That stillness has teeth. I stood by the window one evening, as the light curved across the floor like a ribbon dropped mid-motion. Behind me I heard his steps. Not approaching. Just existing. The way thunder exists in a sky that hasn't yet decided whether to rain. We never spoke of it. But the echo of that silence said everything. It wasn't that I'd never stepped off the map before. It was just the first time I did it with my eyes open. Claire had just stepped out from the darkroom when she asked, not looking up from her camera bag, "Did Julian play you his new piece yet, Mom?" The word yet landed with the weight of a held breath. I didn't answer. I only folded the same dish towel I had folded yesterday, twice, then once again, though it was already neat. She didn't ask again. But she paused longer than necessary before heading back upstairs. That afternoon, the cello was lying across the couch in the sunroom, the one I used to sit on when I watched the rain. Now it had its own place like it belonged more than I did. The silence in the house wasn't accusing, but it had edges. It pressed against walls that once felt familiar. Julian and I hadn't spoken in 2 days. He stayed out late. I worked longer in the studio, letting the clay spin and collapse beneath my palms. I found myself shaping curves I didn't recognize, lines that weren't functional but felt, remembered. Once my fingers slipped too fast, and a shallow groove ran along the spine of the vase I was forming, just about where a hand might rest on a back briefly, then hesitate. I didn't smooth it out. The garden was quiet that evening. The lavender had begun to lean, tired from too much sun. Julian was there, under the fig tree, tying a low branch with soft jute. His hair fell into his eyes. He didn't brush it away. He didn't look up when he asked, "If you could go back, would you choose silence or sound?" He wasn't asking about music. I sat beside the cello later. Its varnish held the warmth of the day, the cushion underneath still dented from where he used to sit. There was a red mark on the wood, faint but visible, maybe from wine or maybe from a thumb pressed too long. I didn't wipe it. In the kitchen the towel had fallen. No one picked it up. The glass I used that night still sat by the sink, with the softest crescent of a lip print barely clinging to its side. I had washed everything else. Sometimes I think guilt is just memory that refuses to blur. Claire never brought it up again. But she lingered longer in the doorway some nights. I don't know if she knew, or if she chose to let the question stay unanswered. I think of what I never dared say aloud. There are compositions not meant to be performed for anyone else, only to remind you that your voice, however cracked, however late, is still yours. And that silence, when broken with care, can sound a lot like truth. I think of what I never dared say aloud. There are compositions not meant to be performed for anyone else, only to remind you that your voice, however cracked, however late, is still yours. Claire's suitcase rolled softly across the hallway tiles. It was early, just past the hour when night turns into something less certain. She didn't rush. At the threshold, her eyes swept the living room, pausing not on objects, but on the silence they held. When she embraced me, her arms lingered, not asking forgiveness, not offering explanation, just long enough for two women to acknowledge a truth between them without saying it aloud. She didn't mention Julian. She didn't need to. As the car disappeared down the gravel path, I didn't wave. I watched the dust rise then fall. The house stood still behind me, walls holding their breath, light pooling carefully across the kitchen floor. The tea towel on the hook hung perfectly straight, but a corner curled like it remembered being dropped. I made coffee, the kind Claire didn't like, too bitter, too strong. I drank it slowly, tasting each note as though it could change the texture of the morning. Then I opened the studio door. It groaned against the frame, the sound sharp in the otherwise sacred hush. The kiln stood like a sleeping animal, faithful, forgotten. I hadn't touched it in years. The smell of old clay rose up like memory being warmed from beneath. I ran my palm across the workbench, dust grain waiting. And there it was. A single sheet of music. Resting where I usually kept my trimming wire. No envelope. Just the familiar slant of Julian's handwriting, steady and spare. No title. Only a line at the bottom. For what we never dared to name. I didn't move for a long while. Only listened as the wind shifted outside. Then I reached for the power switch. The kiln came alive with a low hum, and the studio exhaled. Something in me did too. Later that day I walked into town. The community board was cluttered with offers and events. I found the form tucked beneath a flyer for ballroom classes. Evening ceramics instructor needed. I filled it out in the hallway, ink smudging slightly as my hand trembled. Not from fear but from recognition. That evening I placed a clean white towel in the kitchen. The cello played again, this time from the old speaker I had nearly forgotten how to use. I let it play while the sun folded itself into the horizon. I wasn't thinking of Julian. I wasn't even thinking of Claire. I was thinking about a version of myself I had once paused mid-sentence. She was starting to speak again. The clay beneath my fingers responded differently now. Not obedient but open. Like it too had waited to be reclaimed. I used to believe freedom was in the leaving. But maybe it's this. To stay. To stand where it began. And to stop pretending you were ever invisible in your own story. I didn't fall. I walked in with both feet, with my eyes open, and my hands not asking permission. I wasn't taken. I wasn't tricked. I chose. And I would again, not because it was easy or even right, but because it was honest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's host. I was simply someone. There was a time I whispered my wants into pillows. Apologized for taking space, for asking, for even existing too loudly. And I wonder, why do we teach ourselves to shrink from the very things that make us human? Desire doesn't make us weak. Silencing it does. You don't need to tear the world down to remember who you are. Sometimes you just have to stop saying sorry and listen for the sound your own name makes when no one's speaking it for you. Because the real awakening? It doesn't shout. It arrives in the quiet, when you're alone with a choice, and you say yes without flinching. If you saw a piece of yourself here, in the silence, in the glances, in the weight of things left unsaid, then maybe, just maybe, this story is yours too. Leave a like, not for me, but for the version of you who once waited too long to choose himself. And if this story sat with you in some quiet part of your chest, share it. Quiet stories deserve to be heard too. Who knows? Maybe somewhere, someone's still waiting for the courage to name the thing they already feel. I never told anyone about the day Claire left, but the cello never played that same way again. And maybe that's why he never came back.